The truth about my mother shocked an entire city. I was 62 years old when I received the letter that turned my entire life upside down. A thick cream-colored envelope with the Detroit School District seal lay among the usual bills and advertising flyers. Inside was an invitation to the opening ceremony of the new Dorothy Jones Library at Roosevelt Middle School. Dorothy Jones. I had heard that name only a few times in my life from my adoptive parents. My biological mother, who gave me up at 17 and disappeared from my life forever. I had never tried to find her. Honestly, I had even been angry at her for most of my life. What kind of mother abandons her child? But why was a school in Detroit naming a library after her? I had lived in Colorado my entire conscious life, worked as a math teacher, retired 2 years ago. Detroit was just the name of the city where I was born and taken from as an infant. I called the school and introduced myself as Dorothy Jones's daughter. The woman on the other end gasped so loudly that I moved the phone away from my ear. The secretary began speaking quickly and excitedly, saying I had to come, that my mother was a school legend, that everyone at the school had dreamed of someday meeting her daughter. A legend? My mother was a janitor, as far as I knew. What could be legendary about mopping floors? 2 weeks later, I boarded a plane to Detroit, tormented by curiosity and strange anxiety. What would I learn about the woman who gave me life and then turned away from me? Roosevelt Middle School stood in one of Detroit's most troubled neighborhoods. A gray 1960s building, peeling walls, bars on some windows. But inside, everything gleamed with cleanliness, and the corridors were full of children of all skin colors, speaking different languages. The school principal, an African-American woman in her 50s with kind eyes, met me at the entrance. Patricia Washington introduced herself and immediately began telling me about my mother. It turned out that Dorothy had changed her life when Patricia was a child, from a troubled family whom everyone considered hopeless. But Miss Dorothy believed in her. We walked down the hallway, and I noticed something strange. Dozens of photos of graduates from different years hung on the walls, and many had small golden plaques underneath. Graduate of Miss Dorothy's program. I asked what this program was. Patricia stopped and turned to me. She explained that my mother had worked here as a janitor for 40 years, but after official hours, she transformed into a teacher, mentor, psychologist, and sometimes the only adult who cared about these children. We entered an old basement classroom that was now used as storage. Patricia turned on the light, and I saw something incredible. Hundreds of children's drawings, thank you letters, and photographs hung on the walls. In the corner stood an old blackboard with chalk writing, "Miss Dorothy says, you can become anything." Patricia told me this was where it all began. Every day after work, my mother would come down here with children who were struggling in school. She couldn't read well herself. She learned alongside them. A woman who barely finished 8th grade taught children math, history, and helped with homework. My heart tightened. Mom couldn't read well, but she taught others? Patricia showed me a worn notebook. These were my mother's records. She kept track of every child she worked with. I opened the notebook and saw neat childish handwriting. Tyrone Davis, can't read, parents struggling with addiction. Started with letters September 15. Learn to read simple words by Christmas. Maria Gonzalez, parents don't speak English. Girl is shy. helping with English every Tuesday and Thursday. James Wilson, father beats him, bruises on arms. Called social services anonymously. Page after page, dozens of names, dates, small victories, and big problems. I asked how she did all this. Didn't she have her own life? Patricia smiled, sadly, and explained that Dorothy had a life. These children were her life. She lived in a small apartment 3 blocks away. Never married after having me. Devoted everything to the school. We went upstairs where guests were already gathering for the ceremony. I expected to see a few teachers and administrators. Instead, the hall was full of people of all ages. Men in suits, women in elegant dresses, elderly couples, young families with children. Patricia took the stage. She announced the opening of the Dorothy Jones Library, but said she first wanted everyone to hear what this woman meant to the community. The first man to approach the microphone was about 40, in an expensive suit. He introduced himself as Tyrone Davis, a pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon. But in 1985, he was an 8-year-old boy who couldn't read. His mother was struggling with substance abuse. There was no father. He was angry, got into fights. Everyone thought he'd end up in trouble. He stopped, wiping his eyes. The man told how Miss Dorothy saw something in him that no one else saw. She stayed with him every day after school, taught him to read with a first-grade primer. Even though he was already 8, fed him because there was often no food at home. And most importantly, she believed in him. Next was a Latino woman. Maria Gonzalez Wright introduced herself as an English teacher at this same school. As a child, she was embarrassed to speak English because her parents didn't know the language. Children laughed at her accent. Miss Dorothy worked with her on pronunciation every day after work. She recorded her speech on an old tape recorder. Then they would listen and correct mistakes. Story after story. Doctors, teachers, police officers, entrepreneurs. All had once been children from troubled families who were considered hopeless, and all spoke of one person, a woman who saw potential in them. But the most stunning story was yet to come. An elderly African-American man with a cane approached the microphone. Robert Jones introduced himself as a 71-year-old retiree. In 1978, he worked as a security guard at this school, and he wanted to tell what few people knew about Miss Dorothy. The hall fell silent. Robert explained that Miss Dorothy did much more than just teach children. She saved them, literally. In the late 70s, their neighborhood was very dangerous. Drugs, gangs, violence. And there were children who had nowhere to go home. Robert paused, gathering his strength. He told how Miss Dorothy turned a school basement into a shelter. Officially, it didn't exist, but children knew if it was dangerous at home, you could come to the school's back door and knock quietly. Miss Dorothy would let them in, feed them leftovers from the school cafeteria, let them sleep on mattresses in the basement. My eyes filled with tears. Robert told how he helped her, watched so no one got caught. Because if authorities found out, she would have been fired, maybe even arrested. But children were more important than rules. Robert looked directly at me. For 20 years, hundreds of children passed through this shelter. Some for one night, some lived there for months, until Miss Dorothy found them a safe place. She was like an underground railroad, only saving children from their own families. The next story made me understand the scale of what my mother did. An elegant woman my age with gray hair approached the microphone. Linda Thompson introduced herself as a social worker. In 1988, she was 15 and pregnant by her stepfather. Her mother threw her out of the house, calling her a whore. She didn't know where to go. She cried, but continued. Linda told how Miss Dorothy didn't just shelter her at school. She found a doctor who agreed to deliver the baby for free, learned herself how to care for a newborn. And when Linda decided to give the child up for adoption, Dorothy helped find a good family in Michigan. Linda looked directly at me. She said she knew about my story from Miss Dorothy herself. Dorothy told her how, 6 years earlier, she had gone through the same thing. Rape, pregnancy at 17, the decision to give up her daughter for adoption. Dorothy said the experience with her own daughter taught her how to help other girls in similar situations. My breath caught. This was another example of how my mother used her pain to help others. But the story wasn't finished yet. An elderly African-American woman rose from a front row seat and slowly approached the microphone. Esther Jones introduced herself as Dorothy's older sister. "Do I have an aunt?" Esther said she had to tell the truth about why Dorothy gave me up. She looked at me with infinite sadness. In 1981, Dorothy was 17 years old. She was smart, did well in school, dreamed of going to college. But their stepfather attacked her, hurt her in the worst way possible. Heavy silence hung in the hall. Esther continued that when Dorothy became pregnant, the family threw her out, said it was her own fault, that she had brought shame to the family. A 17-year-old girl attacked by someone she trusted, and they blamed her for it. Esther wiped away tears. She told how Dorothy lived in a home for pregnant teens, worked there as a cleaner to pay for a roof over her head. When Susan was born, Dorothy realized she couldn't give her daughter a good life. She was just a traumatized teenage girl with no education or family support. I felt my world crumbling. Esther continued that Dorothy spent months looking for the perfect family for Susan. Checked documents, met with couples, even traveled to Colorado to make sure the adoptive parents were worthy people. Esther looked directly at me. She said my mother didn't abandon me. She made the hardest decision of her life to give me a chance at happiness. But the most amazing part was yet to come. And then, Esther continued, Dorothy decided that if she couldn't be a mother to her own child, she would become a mother to all children who needed her. Esther pulled out an old photograph. The picture was taken in 1985. Dorothy with the first group of children she taught to read. The photograph showed a young African-American woman, very much like me, surrounded by a dozen children of different races. Everyone was smiling. Dorothy held a copy of Alice in Wonderland. Esther explained this was where it all began. Dorothy told her she couldn't give her daughter maternal love, but she would give it to hundreds of other children. Maybe this would compensate for her failure as a mother. I couldn't hold back and cried. Not just cried, sobbed like a child. Failure as a mother? This woman who devoted her entire life to saving children considered herself a failure? Patricia came over and hugged me. She said my mother talked about me every day. She had my photograph on her desk, the one the adoptive parents sent when I turned 1. She knew I had become a teacher, knew I was happy, and that was more important to her than anything. The next few hours passed like a fog. People approached me, telling stories about my mother. Each story revealed a new facet of her personality. Former security guard Robert told how Dorothy secretly bought clothes for poor children with her janitor's salary. The school nurse shared a memory of how Dorothy learned to perform basic medical procedures to help children whose parents couldn't afford a doctor. The local priest told how Dorothy regularly brought children to church, not for religion, but because there was a free meal program there. But the most amazing story came from a woman named Grace Williams. In 1995, her 14-year-old daughter disappeared. Police said she had probably run away with a boyfriend and didn't search much. But Miss Dorothy believed Grace. Grace squeezed my hands. She told how my mother created her own search team from her former students. They went around the entire city, showing Grace's daughter's photo, asking everyone. Miss Dorothy even went into neighborhoods where Black women risked their lives. I asked what happened. Grace answered that they found her after 2 weeks. She was in a dangerous place, hurt and scared, but alive. Miss Dorothy herself got her out of there, took her to the hospital, sat with her while doctors provided care. Grace cried. Now her daughter is married, has 2 children, works as a psychologist with teenagers, all thanks to my mother. By evening, I learned the incredible truth. My mother was an unofficial social worker, psychologist, teacher, and savior for an entire neighborhood. Without education, without support, on a janitor's salary, she built a system of help that changed hundreds of lives. But people continued approaching me with new stories. Each revealed a new facet of Dorothy's personality. An elderly white woman named Margaret Connolly told how in 1992 her grandson was expelled from all schools in the district for fighting and hooliganism. The boy was furious about his parents' divorce. No one could handle him. Miss Dorothy suggested Margaret bring her grandson to her every day after school. It turned out Dorothy turned the boy into her assistant. He helped her with cleaning while she talked to him about life. Didn't lecture, didn't scold, just listened. After 6 months, the child changed dramatically. Now he works as a social worker in Chicago. A young Latino man, Carlos Martinez, shared the story of how Miss Dorothy saved him from deportation. In 1998, he was 12. His parents were illegal immigrants. When immigration services came to school for inspection, Miss Dorothy hid Carlos in the basement and said he was sick at home. But she didn't stop there. Dorothy contacted a pro bono lawyer, helped Carlos's family file legalization documents. The process took 3 years. And all this time, Miss Dorothy made sure the boy continued studying. Now Carlos is a federal judge. A middle-aged woman named Deborah Hill told a completely incredible story. In 1994, she worked in Child Protective Services. She regularly received anonymous calls about children being abused in families. The information was always accurate. Children were saved. Deborah spent years trying to figure out who this mysterious informant was. Only after Miss Dorothy's death did she understand the truth. Dorothy created an informal observation network. Children she taught told her about problems at home. Dorothy carefully documented all cases of abuse and passed information to protective services without identifying herself. Over 20 years, more than 100 children were saved through such calls. But the most amazing story came from a woman named Sandra Washington. She was director of the local homeless shelter. Every Friday for 15 years, they received an anonymous package with food, clothing, and hygiene supplies. Sandra always thought these were donations from some church or charity organization. After Miss Dorothy's death, she received a letter from a lawyer. It turned out that all these years, the anonymous benefactor was a school janitor who spent half her salary helping the homeless. The letter said Dorothy understood what it meant to have no home because she herself lived in a shelter as a pregnant teenager. The local library director, an elderly man named Arthur Green, told about Miss Dorothy's summer reading program. Every summer, Dorothy brought dozens of children from poor families to the library. She paid for their library cards and fines for overdue books herself. But most importantly, she read to the children aloud. Arthur remembered how Dorothy sat in the children's section of the library, surrounded by a crowd of multicolored children, reading them Harry Potter or the Chronicles of Narnia. The children listened with bated breath. Many of these children heard stories about magical worlds for the first time, where good conquers evil, where ordinary people can become heroes. Arthur showed me an old photograph. Dorothy in the library, summer 2005, reading a book to 20 children. Everyone looked at her with adoration. She was more than a teacher to them. She was a window to a world of possibilities. A young woman named Ashley Carter approached me near the end of the evening. She was about 30, holding a small boy. Ashley told how, as a teenager, she had fallen into addiction. At 16, she lived on the street, in dangerous situations just to survive. Police, social services, even her own family gave up on her. But Miss Dorothy didn't give up. Every week, she came to neighborhoods where people with addiction lived, looking for Ashley. Brought food, clean clothes, basic supplies. Didn't preach, didn't demand immediate recovery. Just showed that someone still believed Ashley could change. This process took 2 years. Dorothy took the girl to rehabilitation centers when she was ready, sat with her during recovery, helped her enroll in a GED program for adults. Ashley showed me her son. His name is Dorothy Jr. If not for my mom, he wouldn't exist, because Ashley wouldn't exist. Now, Ashley works as an addiction counselor and helps other young people get their lives back on track. Stories continued until late at night. Each was unique, but all told of one person, a woman who saw potential where others saw only problems. Physical education teacher Rosemary Jackson told how Miss Dorothy created an informal nutrition program for children. She noticed which students came to school hungry and left forgotten sandwiches for them in classrooms. Local police officer Michael O'Connor shared a memory of how Miss Dorothy prevented conflicts between teenage gangs. She knew all the children in the neighborhood, understood who was in conflict with whom, and could resolve disputes before they escalated into fights. A doctor from the local clinic, Dr. Ahmed Hassan, told how Miss Dorothy regularly brought children with injuries and infections to him. She paid for treatment out of her own pocket for families who couldn't afford it. But the most touching story came from Gloria Williams, an elderly woman who worked as a cook in the school cafeteria. In 1989, Gloria was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was a single mother of 3 children with no insurance. Gloria was preparing for death, not knowing what would happen to her children. Miss Dorothy learned about the diagnosis and quietly took the situation into her own hands. She found a charity program that paid for treatment for low-income people, filled out all the documents for Gloria, drove her to chemotherapy procedures because Gloria had no car. But most importantly, Dorothy cared for Gloria's children while she was being treated, picked them up from school, fed them, helped with homework, put them to bed. Gloria beat cancer. Now, her children are adults with their own families. All got higher education. My mom gave Gloria not just life. She gave life to her children and grandchildren. By midnight, a whole crowd of people had gathered around me. Men and women of different ages, races, professions. But they all had one thing in common. At some point in their lives, they were saved by a school janitor named Dorothy Jones. Tyrone, the cardiothoracic surgeon, organized fundraising from new medical equipment for the school. Maria, the teacher, created a scholarship program named after Miss Dorothy for children from disadvantaged families. Carlos, the judge, founded a legal clinic for immigrants. Each of them found a way to continue the work my mother started. But there was one more story that made me understand the true scale of Dorothy's influence. A middle-aged woman named Victoria Brown approached me at the very end of the evening. She introduced herself as coordinator of a mentoring program in 5 Detroit schools. Victoria told how the program was created in 2010 by a group of Roosevelt School graduates. All were former Miss Dorothy protégés. They decided to create an official version of what their mentor did informally. Over 9 years, the program covered more than 1,000 children. Every at-risk child has an adult mentor who helps with studies, career planning, personal problems. Miss Dorothy was a mentor to several hundred children, and these children became mentors to thousands of others. This is exponential growth of good. Victoria showed me program statistics. Children participating in mentoring are 70% more likely to finish school, 60% less likely to end up in prison, 80% more likely to go to college. My mother created a model. They just made it systematic. The program involved people of all professions: doctors, teachers, engineers, police officers, social workers. Many were once Miss Dorothy's protégés themselves. Victoria told about plans to expand the program to the entire state of Michigan. There's interest in other states too. The Miss Dorothy Method mentoring model could help thousands of children across the country. By 1 a.m., I was finally alone with Patricia in the empty school hall. She asked if I now understood why they named the library after Mom. I nodded, unable to speak. Patricia continued that the most amazing thing was that Miss Dorothy never considered herself special. She thought she was just doing what any adult should do, caring for children. Patricia showed me the last photograph, Dorothy in 2018, a year before her death. Already an elderly woman, but still surrounded by children in the library. She worked until the very end. Even when doctors said she had cancer, she continued coming to school. Said children were more important than illness. I asked if Mom suffered. Physically, yes, but spiritually, she was the happiest person Patricia knew. Because she saw the results of her work every day, saw how the children she saved were saving other children. Patricia fell silent, then added quietly, "She told me what Mom talked about before dying. Not about pain, not about regrets. She talked about me, that she hoped I would understand. She loved me no less than all the other children, just differently." But the most important discovery awaited me at Aunt Esther's house. Before this, Esther showed me the apartment where my mother lived all these years. It was a small one-room apartment in an old house 3 blocks from school. Modest furniture, an old TV, a kitchen the size of a closet. But the walls were covered with photographs of children. Hundreds of photographs, over 40 years. Esther explained this was Mom's family. Every child she helped sent photographs. weddings, graduations, children, grandchildren. Dorothy followed everyone's life. In the corner of the room stood an old desk. On it lay neat stacks of letters, hundreds of thank you letters from former students and their families. Esther showed me one dated 2015. Dear Miss Dorothy, this is Antonio Hernandez writing. Remember the boy you taught to read in 1987? Today, I defended my doctoral dissertation in education. My wife is pregnant with our first child. We'll name our daughter Dorothy in your honor. Thank you for believing in a 7-year-old boy who couldn't read. Another letter was from Maria Gonzalez. Miss Dorothy, today I turned 40. I have a wonderful family. I love my job as a teacher, all thanks to you. Every day when I enter the classroom, I think, what would Miss Dorothy do? How would she help this difficult child? You live in each of us you saved. Letters came from all over the country. Dorothy's children moved to different states but didn't forget the woman who changed their lives. In the bedroom stood an old dresser with a special box on top, the same one Esther showed me on the first day. Esther said Dorothy left something for me and led me to the small bedroom. On the dresser was a box labeled for Susan, when she's ready to know the truth. Inside were letters, dozens of letters written over 40 years. The first was dated 1982. My dear daughter, today you are 1 month old. I'm giving you to the Johnson family in Colorado. They are good people. Mr. Johnson is a teacher. Mrs. Johnson is a nurse. They will give you everything I cannot. I'm not crying because I know this is right, but my heart is breaking. I will always love you. Mom. Letter from 1987. Today I taught a boy named Antonio to read. He's 7 years old, the same age you are now. When he smiled seeing he could read a whole sentence, I thought of you. I hope you smile too when you read books. 1995. I received your school photo from the Johnson family. You're so beautiful and smart. They write that you're an honor student. Today I helped a girl named Maria with math, and she finally understood fractions. I imagined I was teaching you. 2010. I learned you became a math teacher. My heart is ready to explode with pride. You chose the most important profession in the world. I knew you would help people. It's in your blood. The last letter was dated 2018, a year before Dorothy's death. My dear Susan, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I hope you're not angry at me for giving you up. I hope you understand it was the only right decision I could make. I spent 40 years trying to atone for what I considered my failure as a mother. But now, at the end of life, I understand. Perhaps I gave you more than if I had raised you myself. You grew up in a loving family, got an education, became a teacher, helped children like I did, but you have what I didn't: stability, support, a normal life. And the children I helped are my gift to the world. Indirectly yours, too, because every time I saved a child, I thought of you. I was never your mom in the usual sense, but I was a mother to hundreds of children in your honor. I hope you're proud of me, because I was proud of you all my life. Your mom who always loved you. Dorothy. I read the letters all night, crying and laughing at the same time. By morning, I understood. My mother didn't abandon me. She simply loved me so much that she gave me to another family, then spent her entire life trying to compensate for this betrayal, though there was no betrayal. The next day, I went to Roosevelt School again, but now not as a visitor, but as the daughter of a legend. Principal Patricia told me more details about Mom's last years. It turned out when Dorothy was diagnosed with cancer in 2017, she refused aggressive treatment. Not because she wanted to die, but because chemotherapy would make her too weak to work with children. She told Patricia she had little time left and wanted to spend it on what mattered. Doctors said treatment could give her 2 or 3 more years, but she chose 1 year of full life. That last year, Dorothy worked with doubled energy, as if understanding she needed to pass her experience to the next generation. She began recording video lessons for future mentors. Simple, practical advice. How to talk to a traumatized child. How to notice signs of domestic violence. How to motivate the teenager not to drop out of school. Patricia showed me these recordings. Mom sat in the same basement classroom where she taught children for 40 years, patiently explaining, if a child is aggressive, don't take it personally. Aggression is a cry for help. Ask, what upset you? Not, why are you behaving this way? Never promise what you can't deliver. Children from troubled families have already faced adult deception many times. Most important is consistency. Come every day, even if the child pushes you away. Show that you won't disappear like other adults in their life. Over the last year, Mom recorded more than 50 such lessons. Now, they're used in volunteer training programs throughout Michigan. Patricia also told me about Mom's legacy project. In her final months, Dorothy gathered all her former protégés and asked them to create a guide for other mentors. The result was a 300-page book, How to Save a Child, a practical guide to the Dorothy Jones method. It contains specific cases, solutions, mistakes, and successes. Tyrone Davis, the cardiothoracic surgeon, wrote a chapter on working with aggressive children. Maria Gonzalez wrote about helping immigrant children. Carlos Martinez covered legal aspects of child protection. The book is distributed free among social workers, teachers, volunteers. In 2 years since Mom's death, it's been downloaded more than 10,000 times. Mom wanted her methods to outlive her. She understood that one woman could save hundreds of children, and if you teach hundreds of women, you can save tens of thousands. Patricia showed me the final surprise. In the new Dorothy Jones library was a special section, Miss Dorothy's Corner. There stood all the books she used to teach children, her old chair, photographs with students. But the most important exhibit was an interactive memory wall. On a touch screen, you could find stories of all the children Mom helped. Doctors, teachers, social workers, police officers, engineers, artists, all told how a school janitor changed their lives. Every story ended the same way. Now I help others because Miss Dorothy taught me it matters. And there was a plaque, Dorothy Jones, 1964 to 2019. A janitor who cleaned not only dirt, but hopelessness from children's hearts. Mother to hundreds of children. Hero without title. I asked them to add another line, and the most loving mother imaginable. That day, I made the decision that changed the rest of my life. I sold my house in Colorado and moved to Detroit. At 62, I began a new career, became a volunteer at Roosevelt School, continuing Mom's work. But moving was just the beginning. I wanted to understand exactly how the system my mother created worked. How could one woman so effectively help hundreds of children? I wanted to learn from her methods while being mindful that some stories contain difficult themes about overcoming challenging circumstances. But every story ultimately showed hope and transformation. Aunt Esther introduced me to the inner circle, a group of people who helped Mom all these years. It turned out Dorothy didn't work alone. Robert Jones, the former security guard, told me about the safety net. Mom had allies in all key places. School nurses who reported suspicious injuries, school bus drivers who noticed which children regularly came late or looked unkempt, cafeteria cooks who knew which children were always hungry. Miss Dorothy taught them all to be observant. They became her eyes and ears. If someone noticed a problem, they reported it to her. Gloria Williams, the cafeteria cook, told about Operation Breakfast. Every morning, Dorothy came to the cafeteria half an hour before classes started. Together with Gloria, she prepared extra sandwiches for children who came to school hungry. They pretended these were leftovers from the day before. Children thought they were just lucky. No one felt like an object of charity. School nurse Barbara Cole shared memories of medical education for Mom. Dorothy came to her after work and learned to recognize signs of various problems: malnutrition, domestic violence, neglect, depression. She was the best diagnostician Barbara knew. Noticed problems before professionals because she spent more time with children than anyone else. I also learned about Mom's financial tricks. Arthur Green, the librarian, told how Dorothy never had much money but knew how to stretch it. She bought clothes and shoes at secondhand stores, but chose quality items, washed and mended them so they looked new. Children never felt they were getting used things. Mom also knew how to find free resources. Made arrangements with local doctors for free checkups for children. Convinced dentists to treat teeth for symbolic fees. Found lawyers willing to help immigrant families pro bono. She didn't just spend money on problems. She created connections between people who needed help and those who could provide it. A month after moving, I met Marcus Thompson, a social worker who had collaborated with Mom unofficially for many years. Marcus told me about the most difficult part of Mom's work: cases of serious domestic violence. When a child was in real danger, action had to be swift and careful. Miss Dorothy developed an entire system. First, she documented everything: photographed bruises, recorded children's stories, gathered evidence. Then contacted Marcus or other social workers. But Mom understood that official intervention didn't always help. Sometimes children ended up in foster families that were no better than their birth families. So she had an unofficial system too. If a child didn't want to go to foster care, Miss Dorothy found relatives or acquaintances willing to take them temporarily. She also helped parents solve problems that led to family conflicts: substance abuse, unemployment, mental health issues. Marcus showed me statistics. Over 20 years of collaboration with Mom, 89% of children from violent families were saved. 60% of families were restored after solving basic problems. Marcus explained that usually social services either take the child or leave them in a dangerous situation. Miss Dorothy offered a third way: treat the family while the child is safe. Over 6 months in Detroit, I immersed myself in the world my mother created. Every day revealed new details of her system. This wasn't just helping individual children. It was an entire philosophy of changing community through caring for its most vulnerable members. I began working as a volunteer at school, but quickly realized that simply repeating what Mom did wasn't enough. The world had changed in 40 years. New problems appeared: cyberbullying, social media addiction, new types of drugs. but Mom's principles remained relevant. See potential in every child, be a constant source of support, create a help network from ordinary people. The first child I began teaching math was named Damien, a 7-year-old boy from a troubled family, angry at the whole world, exactly like Tyrone Davis once was. But working with Davian was harder than I expected. The boy didn't trust adults, often ran away from lessons, screamed that he didn't want to learn. I felt helpless. How did Mom make it look so easy? Then I turned to Mom's video recordings. In one clip, she talked about working with difficult children. Dorothy said the main thing was not to take aggression personally and understand that anger always hides pain. I changed my approach. Instead of immediately forcing Damien to solve problems, I just sat next to him, brought him apples and cookies, told funny stories about numbers, demanded nothing in return. The breakthrough came after a month. Damien came to school with a split lip after fighting with his stepfather. Instead of going to the principal or calling social services, I just hugged him and said he was safe. That day, Damien first let me teach him to add numbers. When he correctly solved 3 + 4, his face lit up with pride. And in that smile, I saw my mom. But Damien's story was just the beginning. After 6 months, a group of Mom's former protégés approached me with a proposal to create a formal mentoring program based at Roosevelt School. The idea was to take the best of Mom's methods and adapt them to modern realities. The program was called Dorothy's Bridge because Mom was a bridge between despair and hope for hundreds of children. Tyrone Davis agreed to become the program's medical consultant. Maria Gonzalez took on the educational part. Carlos Martinez helped with legal issues. Ashley Carter, the former addict Mom saved, became a specialist working with at-risk teenagers. Each brought their own experience and professional knowledge to the program, but all followed Mom's basic principles: consistency, unconditional acceptance, belief in every child's potential. The Dorothy's Bridge program began in September 2022. In the first year, we took 30 children from the most difficult families. Each child had a primary mentor and a support team of specialists. Results exceeded all expectations. By the end of the school year, 90% of children improved their grades, 85% stopped skipping classes, 70% showed significant behavioral improvement. But most importantly, the children changed internally. They believed they were worthy of love and support, that their future could be better than their past. The program's story attracted local media attention, then national. An article in the Detroit Free Press was titled "School Janitor's Legacy Changes Education System." A CNN report was called "How One Woman Created an Army of Child Saviors." The attention was nice, but the biggest reward from me was a letter I received from Damien at the end of the first program year. He drew a picture, a woman in an apron surrounded by children, and wrote, "Miss Susan, you're like Miss Dorothy. Thank you for not giving up on me." By 2023, the Dorothy's Bridge program began implementation in other Detroit schools. Then cities in Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania showed interest. Mom's methods spread across the country like waves from a stone thrown in water. In each city, the program was adapted to local conditions, but the foundation remained the same. Find ordinary people willing to devote time to children. Teach them to see potential where others see only problems. Over 2 years, the Dorothy's Bridge program helped more than 500 children in 7 states. But for me, the most important remained the group of 30 children at Roosevelt School, my first students. Damien, the boy who didn't want to learn math, became one of the best students in class by the end of the second year. His dream is to become a teacher like Miss Susan and Miss Dorothy. Keisha, a girl from a family where the mother was an alcoholic, learned to read and now devours books one after another. She wants to become a writer and has already written a story about a woman who saved children. Marcus Jr., named after the social worker who helped Mom, dreams of becoming a doctor. His father is in prison. His mother works 3 jobs, but the boy knows he has a whole team of adults who believe in him. Each story is unique, but all are united by one thread: understanding that every child deserves love and support. In 2024, on the 5th anniversary of Mom's death, we organized a special ceremony at Roosevelt School. Everyone gathered, from Mom's first protégés to the youngest participants in the Dorothy's Bridge program. Tyrone Davis, now a 50-year-old cardiothoracic surgeon, brought his family. His teenage daughter plans to become a social worker. He told her Miss Dorothy's story, and now she wants to help children too. Maria Gonzalez Wright presented 40-year statistics. More than 800 children received direct help from Mom. 92% finished school. 78% got higher education. 65% work in professions related to helping others. But most amazing, these 800 people themselves helped thousands more children. The chain reaction of good, started by a school janitor, continues in the 3rd generation. Carlos Martinez, the federal judge, spoke about creating the Dorothy Jones Scholarship Fund. The fund helps children from disadvantaged families get higher education. Over 5 years, more than 100 students received scholarships. Ashley Carter presented a new initiative, mobile help centers called Dorothy's Buses. These are converted school buses that travel through the poorest neighborhoods, providing children with a safe place to do homework, hot meals, and psychological counseling. Each bus has Mom's photo and the inscription, "Miss Dorothy says, you can become anything." But the most touching moment of the ceremony was the presentation by children from the Dorothy's Bridge program. They prepared a presentation about how their lives changed over 2 years. Damien told how he no longer fears going home because he knows tomorrow at school, people who love him are waiting. Keisha read a poem she wrote about a woman who cleaned tears and swept dreams. Marcus Jr. showed his success diary. Every day he writes what new thing he learned. By the end of the evening, it became obvious. Mom created not just a system for helping children. She created a life philosophy based on unconditional love and belief in human potential. This philosophy lives and develops. Universities offer courses on the Dorothy Jones method. Social workers study her approaches to working with traumatized children. Educators adapt her techniques for classroom work. But for me, Mom remained simply Mom, a woman who loved me so much that she gave me to good hands, then spent her entire life proving that choice was right. Today, 3 years later, a new photograph hangs in the Dorothy Jones Library. It shows me with a group of children I teach math after school. Standing with us are Tyrone, Maria, Carlos, Ashley, and dozens of other Dorothy's children who have now become mentors themselves. In this photograph, I look exactly like my mom in that old 1985 photograph. The same eyes, full of love for children. The same smile that says, "I believe in you." Because love isn't about genes. Love is a choice. and my mom chose to love every day of her life. First me, by giving me to good hands, then hundreds of other children who needed her. And now I choose to continue this tradition of love. And not just me, hundreds of people across the country make the same choice every day. Recently, a little girl named Aisha approached me and said I'm like Miss Dorothy, that I believe in her. At that moment, I felt Mom was near, that she's proud of me, that the chain of love she started continues and will continue for many more generations. Because real heroes don't wear capes and don't fly in the sky. They wear janitor's aprons and stay after work to teach a child to read. They sacrifice their own comfort for the happiness of unknown children. They turn personal pain into a source of strength to help others. My mom was such a hero. And now I know each of us can become one. Because in the end, the most important revolutions don't begin in parliament halls or city squares. They begin in the hearts of ordinary people who decide to change one child's life. And that child grows up and changes other children's lives. And so it continues infinitely. In the end, this is true immortality, living in the good you sowed in the world. And by this criterion, my mom will live forever. This is a family tradition, and I'm proud to continue it.